Does Trump have a political philosophy? Yes or no? Today we're going to look at both the yes and the no sides of the answer to that question. Let's begin with the no side. That is, those who believe that Trump does not have any kind of political philosophy. A person who articulates that side of the argument very well is my buddy Prince Charles. Now, that is his actual nickname, except unlike the one that lives in England, he lives in Manhattan and is a property developer. He builds large buildings and large condos, basically, luxury condos. And because he's in that business, he thinks he understands the psyche of a property developer like Trump. And that psyche and that perspective is to pursue self-interest at the expense of everything else. In fact, Prince Charles would argue if you didn't do that, you would not be a very good property developer, because to be a prominent one, you have to be very focused and you have to be good at what you do. And Prince Charles's main problem with Trump is that he thinks that Trump will use government for self-dealing and will use government to make himself wealthier. And therefore, Trump does not have any kind of philosophy. One example of something he does like, one example of the nobility of spirit where one puts national interest above self-interest, might be Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson was the U.S. president in the 60s, and he did not take up the mantle of the Democratic nomination the second time around. He'd already done 4 years, one primary had happened, and then he dropped out. And when he dropped out and didn't take the Democratic nomination for a second term, he got on the television and he said, look, the country is divided. They're divided over Vietnam. They're divided over the race riots. And I can't continue this kind of division through my policies. Instead, I'm going to step aside and let somebody else have a chance. And Prince Charles would take that as an example of the kind of noble spirit he expects of his president. Now, what's the yes side to that argument, the rebuttal, if you will? That is to say, people who believe that Trump has a philosophy, what would they say? Well, an argument on that side would probably or possibly fall into three subsegments. The first is the objectivist philosophy that says that self-interest is the public interest. Secondly, the physiocratic philosophy that says all surplus begins with the farmer. And third, the neo-physicrat philosophy, which says that all surplus belongs to not only the farmer, but also the manufacturing factory worker and the miner and everybody who works with their hand. So let's take a look at these one by one. So Ayn Rand developed the objectivist philosophy. And in her paper, The Virtue of Selfishness, which came out, I believe, in 1964, she argues that not only does self-interest lead to the greater good, but greed is good. And the reason greed is good is because it is natural and it is a source of all great human achievement. She might look at the pyramids of Giza and say this wasn't created because of humility on the part of kings. It was created because the kings wanted to celebrate themselves. And she might argue to Prince Charles with respect to the Lyndon Johnson example, well, who cares whether Trump is self-centered or not? What matters is whether those policies benefits the voter. And in the case of Lyndon Johnson, he was just being disingenuous. The reason he dropped out is not because of some greater good. It's because Bobby Kennedy was about to enter the race and he thought he'd lost. So again, it's self-interest, not some noble calling that resulted in Johnson dropping out. But in addition to this notion that self-interest is the greater good, the second part of the argument is related to the physiocrats. Now, the physiocrats were a school of thought back in France. At least that's where it originated. And one of these physiocrats by the name of Francois Quesnay wrote this book called the Tableau Économique in, I believe it was 1758. And he argued that all value comes from farmers, the initial value. So for example, you put a seed into the ground that costs $1, then a couple of months later you get some kind of crop, and that crop costs $8. Well, the surplus is the 8 minus the 1, which is $7, and that $7 gets put into the bank lends it, companies borrow it and do things with it, hire people with it, those people pay taxes, etc., and that surplus from the farmer compounds, and that results in the wealth of a nation. That was the view of Quesnay. Now, a person like Thomas Jefferson in America was very influenced by Quesnay, and he too believed that the source of all value, economic value, the source, is farming. And that's why he had a problem with Hamilton, who represented the cities. So Hamilton's perspective is that trade creates economic value, economies of scale create economic value. But Jefferson's perspective was, look, big banks, big monopolists, big traders are not of the same interest as a yeoman farmer, and that American policy should protect the yeoman farmer and competitive capitalism, not monopoly capitalism. And so, for example, the U.S. banking system is based on the Jeffersonian notion that decentralized power is good. That's why banks are regulated at the state level in the U.S., and the result is that there's hundreds of banks in the U.S., not just a few like in Canada. So that tradition of Jefferson versus Hamilton is with us even today. But let's look at the neo-physiocrats. The neo-physiocrats said it wasn't just farmers, it was also factory workers and miners and everybody who works with their hand. They are the source of economic value, and everybody else just circulates and compounds that initial surplus. And an example of a proponent of that is J.D. Vance. He just got selected as Trump's VP candidate, but he wrote a book in 2016, I believe it was, called Hillbilly Elegy. And he discusses how he feels the heartland, the man who works with his hands, how they've been systematically ripped off by both the traditional Republican Party and the Democratic Party. How trade deals have affected them negatively. So, for example, there haven't been tariffs that equalize the value of labor in the Midwest with slave labor out of the Uyghurs in China. That there needs to be a focus on the worker and not exclusively on interest groups in the big cities, like the big companies, like the big trading houses, like the special interest groups and the big government groups and the identity politics groups. Instead of that, let's focus on the heartland. That's basically J.D. Vance's argument. So let's summarize. The philosophy of Trump is a philosophy of objectivism in the sense that it assumes that self-interest is the greater interest, but it's also the philosophy of neo-physiocrats. That is to say that the heartland has been done wrong, and that the heartland needs a voice, and that Trump is that voice. That's the argument of those who answer yes to the question, does Trump have a philosophy? And the argument of those who say no is what Prince Charles said, which is there's no philosophy, there's just a greedy narcissist who only focuses on his self-interest. So who's right, the yes or the no? Let me know in the comments.